I suppose, like a lot of people, of course, it was like the school musical when I was a kid, and that just kind of continued, and I always found it a very sort of nurturing environment, and I liked being around creative people. So I continued to do it, and I continued to find really interesting people who were creative and nurturing and fun and intelligent and curious about the world, and I just thought, this is fantastic. And because it wasn't, I mean, there is of course the sort of, the pleasure of having people applaud you and getting recognition for that. But really it was more about that sense of, I suppose, a kind of community of people. There's a community that happens when a cast gets together. It's a temporary thing that everyone has to sort of find their way of working with each other and get to know each other to the point where there's lots of trust. And then you're working, you're delving into other people's stories or historical periods or kind of events or incidents and ways of behaving and the way people tick. All of that's really, really fascinating. So it's always been something that fascinated me, and I have always done it. I've never not done it. So I don't know.
I mean, was there a plan B? Was it always going to be drama?
Yes, it was always going to be drama, much to my parents' dismay. Because I was strangely good at maths for some reason.
Oh,
and, I was like really good at calculus. And he was like, "Oh, engineering." I was like, "No, I don't think so." So yeah, it was always going to be drama. I think it was always a case of like what angle on it. So I have kind of had a few different angles on it between acting itself, and then after moving here, I moved more into directing. And also researching and the academic side, which has always intrigued me. And I mean, obviously I'm here doing this, so I do love that as well.
Yeah. Was there a point in your youth when you said, right, that's it, this is the direction? Were you clear about it, or did you just sort of move that direction?
No, I just moved in that direction, yeah.
And you studied in New York?
Mm-hmm.
You're from New York?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's an exciting, buzzy kind of a place to be.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
So I have to ask, why move to Ireland in 1991?
Well, I fell in love after studying here for 6 months, so that brought me back here.
That's a good reason.
Yeah.
I was reading about the Meisner technique of acting. Right. I was very interested in that. It is fascinating. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Meisner was an actor trainer in New York in the middle of the 20th century. Kind of one of the Stanislavski influenced actor trainers. And his emphasis, because there was Strasberg and Stella Adler and a couple others doing similar things, and they were all part of the similar group. But Meisner's emphasis was very much on essentially being in the moment, an actor being present and listening and reacting. His definition of good acting is behaving truthfully in imaginary circumstances. So there are a number of exercises which he does. One of them is the repeat exercise, where you're just observing the person opposite you, saying what they look like, just describing them physically, and the other person has to just repeat that. And it's about getting a connection between two people. And you bring that into a scene, and you suddenly find that the scene has been transformed because these people have a much stronger connection with each other, and they're reacting very intuitively to each other. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what it's trying to do.
So is this a technique that you work on prior to learning a script, for example?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it would be one of the kind of foundations of actor training, of Stanislavski-based actor training, that I would bring to my work, yeah.
And is it improvisationary in nature?
Yes, in the sense that you're not using a script. I mean, you're also not creating a scene necessarily. That does happen in sort of a later stage of the training, where you then sort of construct some imaginary circumstances in which you use the repeat exercise, and you begin to just react and interact off each other. So yes, it is improvisation in that sense, yeah.
I read that before he was an actor and developed this method, he was a piano player. He studied in what became Juilliard.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think, I found that interesting, because the improvisationary nature of the acting method is slightly at odds with the musical training of a conservatory, where you have to do things in very strict boxes, so to
Yeah,
speak.
that's true. Maybe that's why he gave up music, because he wanted something that was more fluid. But also, I mean, he was very strict with his discipline with his actors, you know, in relation to just the precision of the kinds of interactions he was looking for. Having said that, precision in the sense of making sure that you're in the moment. So what that means is, I mean, there's something that actors can often fall into of kind of thinking ahead and kind of predicting what's going to happen, and therefore you can feel that in an audience when that's happening because the actor's not just there in the moment. So in relation to his precision, it was about that. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's...
Okay, yeah. And is it a method of acting that you chose, or did it choose you?
It kind of chose me, in the sense of the training that I did in New York. It was the sort of center of that. I didn't know anything about it going into it. But it is quite predominant in American actor training, so it's not unusual that a lot of American actors would have that.
So you brought it with you, really, when you came to Ireland?
I did, yeah.
Almost 30 years ago, actually.
Yeah, who's counting?
Were there other people teaching that method here when you came?
Not that I know of, no. I mean, there's been Stanislavski-based training here, particularly Deirdre O'Connell, who studied with Lee Strasberg in New York, who would have been a colleague of Meisner's. So the same kind of principles have existed here, absolutely. Meisner's ways are just kind of, you know, there's a particular way that he gets at those principles. But no, it's not particularly widespread here.
And you use that method here in the Conservatoire?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. And would you incorporate other methods of acting with that, or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I am not is, I think it's important not to be doctrinaire about things, in the sense that if that's not working with this particular actor at this particular moment, then you've got to find another way. And there are other, Stanislavski himself had other methods that I would certainly use. And a lot of the American influence Stanislavski training is very behavioral and psychologically based. And sometimes there are some actors that don't respond very strongly to that, or that might block them. So you kind of have to find another way and maybe go a physical route. So, I mean, my background has not been particularly in physical theatre, but along the way I have picked up ways of working more physically that you then kind of bring to something more psychological and naturalistic. So yeah, for me, it's important that it happens right now in the room, which is a kind of a Meisner thing anyway. But like, if that's not working, then you and I have to figure out a way to get it to work, and let's try a different way. So yeah, you do need to be on your toes and kind of have a whole range of different kinds of methodologies to try to draw on.
Yes, because of course every student who comes in is going to be different character, different personality.
Yeah.
And I suppose teaching anything, you have to adapt a little bit to the student and what their needs are.
Absolutely.
As well.
I mean, if you get resistance, you try to find a way through that so that the student can engage with the method that you're trying to get them to engage in. But there's a point where it's reached, it's like, okay, this really is not working, and then you have to shift gear. So it has to be about the development of that actor.
Of course, yes. And what I was going to ask you is, how much of say a young person, a young actor's success is the technique that they have worked on, and how much of it is raw talent?
Oof. It's both, of course. It is both, of course. But I think raw talent is really not enough to get them to the level that they need to get to. I mean, people have asked me before, do you think actors really need training? And there are plenty of successful actors out there professionally who have not trained. But most of them will have brought a real discipline and rigor to their work, which is the kind of thing that training can bring. And they pick up methods along the way. Usually, a particular director they're working with, brings a way of working with them, and that actor picks it up, and then we'll bring it to the next project they're working on. So there's a kind of ad hoc training on the job that happens with actors who are not trained.
Sure.
I think training is very, very, very useful to get there. Yeah.
And then how much does the personality add in? Because I mean, I suppose with any profession, but particularly in the arts, there's an element of good luck, but there's an element of determination. There's an element of being in the right place at the right time.
All that, yeah.
Do you work on that through their years here, about how to actually, what to do when they get to the end of their degree, what to do next?
So particularly in the final year, yeah, we have kind of professional kind of development in relation to, you know, how to go about contacting the right kinds of people, and how, you know, what you say in the email, how you present yourself, your headshot, your CV, what you put in those things, how to actually walk into an audition room and make sure you're making the right kind of impact. So yeah, we do all that. And personality, of course, feeds into that, because you have to then, I mean, there's a paradox in acting that you kind of have to have a confidence to do it, but at the same time, it's also known as the shy person's revenge, because a lot of actors, you know, really don't want to put themselves out there. So it's about how you actually, you know, how you can actually make an impact in a rehearsal room or an audition room in particular, without necessarily, you know, pretending to be someone you're not, you know.
Well, this is my next question for you. With actors, are there moments when they are not sure where they end and the character begins? Are you always acting?
No, you should not be always acting. Though it's something that it's part of the training as well. I mean, certainly nearly all actor training begins with the self. Like in first year, you're not very often, certainly not in the beginning, playing characters. You're improvising kind of as yourself, again, in imaginary circumstances. So that's, Stanislavski has a term called the magic if. It's like, what if this was a situation, how would you react? So it's important that you are bringing yourself to the table and putting it into the work. That is part of it. But you also have to recognize that these circumstances are imagined circumstances, and when we stop, they're finished, and you have to leave it go. When you leave the rehearsal room, you leave all that stuff behind, and you go home and you be yourself without all of that. So yeah, it's something you have to learn, but yeah, there is a separation, absolutely.
There must be a lot of observation as an actor. You're watching people, you're watching situations and learning from those situations. Do you find sometimes that you might have a dark horse in a student who seems to be very quiet and shy, but actually they're taking everything in and
absolutely
using it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can give you one example of a student who really, you know, it's kind of like we kept trying to draw him out, and it really just wasn't happening. Even by third year, he still hadn't kind of reached the potential that we thought he had. And then he went on to become really, really successful. Like as an actor and a writer and a director, he was just an all-rounder. So he was taking it all in. He just wasn't quite sure how to deliver it at that point in his development. So yeah, and sometimes that's frustrating. But when we saw him take off afterwards, it was like, oh, okay, it was all there.
Okay.
That can happen, yeah.
Because of course, students come to you at 18, I suppose, you know, so you haven't had any, unlike the music students here, oftentimes they've come up through the system. And in my own experience of teaching music is that I see students who are 6 or 7, and, you know, I can see at 6 or 7, this child has got the ingredients to be a musician, you know. So you haven't seen them develop up to the point of being 18. But have you been in situations where you're doing auditions and a young person has come in and you just see something in them that you think, oh my goodness, this needs to be nurtured?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. And we say that very clearly at audition, that you don't have to have experience doing this. You can come in completely raw. In fact, sometimes that's an advantage because you don't have preconceived ideas of what it is. Because on the flip side of that can be if someone has had a lot of, for example, speech and drama training, which tends to be sort of presentational in nature, so that sometimes they have to unlearn some of that in order to get to the kind of acting we're looking for from them. So they're experienced, but it's not the kind of experience that is to their best advantage in what we're trying to get them to do.
must have seen some changes in Ireland in 30 years from the Ireland you arrived to.
Absolutely. Oh my God. Well, initially, certainly, I mean, I arrived here in 91. So as the sort of Celtic Tiger started to take off in the late 90s, I thought, okay, it's becoming a little bit more international. You have different kinds of food arriving in. This is becoming more like New York. And then we discovered that it was all a big bubble. But I've always found, as you say, like, for example, New York is a really, really interesting theatre town. It's very commercial. You know, even the off-Broadway stuff is really, really commercial. And it's one of the things I found really attractive about Dublin was that it seemed to embrace theatre for its own sake, for its cultural worth, as opposed to its just pure entertainment worth, which is more what it is in New York. Now, my New York friends will probably kill me and say, no, there's loads of it, and there is really, really interesting theatre and experimental theatre going on in New York, there's no doubt about it. But it just seemed to be, I remember when I was in New York, when talking to people who were outside of the theatre world, you kind of had to justify yourself as to why you were doing it. It's like, what would you do that for? Whereas here, it's like, oh, right, okay. I mean, I think there's the historical connection with the Abbey Theatre and the founding of the state is all bound up in culture here. So it's kind of just like, yeah. And it's not that more people go to theatre here than go in New York. They don't, you know, it's still a minority sport, really. But there just seems to be an understanding that, okay, that is a significant thing to do. So that's kind of nice. I'm always fascinated about what's going to come up next. I mean, you know, whether it's Dublin Theatre Festival or the Fringe Festivals or going to the Galway Festival or the Kilkenny Festival during the summers, you know, there's always amazing theatre being made in Ireland, and it's always interesting to look at, yeah. And
are the young people, students that you're working with, are they attracted into theatre, or are they looking to go in front of cameras?
I think, I can't speak for them, but based on some feedback that we've done, I think most of them would experience theatre mostly in a kind of community theatre environment or youth theatre environment. So surprisingly, very few of them have seen professional theatre. Partly that's, you know, there's a limited availability and it can be expensive, so it's not necessarily something that a lot of young people would be going to. So it's more that, and I think what, you know, their cultural references would not necessarily be theatre. So, you know, the things that we're asking them to read are just way outside of their experience, and they're kind of just baffled by it sometimes. So that can be tricky. Of course, yes, they are more used to screens between television and film, so those would be their cultural references, and those are also the references they look to when it comes to acting, which is fine because there's some amazing acting there. What I would say is sometimes when we go to something a little bit more sort of physical theatre or something like that, or something that's more abstract, they can struggle with that, trying to figure out why that would be important to do from an acting point of view.
What is it about directing that you enjoy so much?
Yeah, maybe that was a moment that I made a decision where I was like, I'm not going to act anymore, really. And I think it had to do partly with that in the moment thing where like there was always a part of my brain which was keyed into the bigger picture of the play or the world that we were creating on any project. So I recognized that I had ideas, that I had opinions about how this should go, which of course, depending on the kind of project you're working on, sometimes those are welcomed by a director and sometimes they aren't. But I just thought, yeah, I kind of have a philosophical kind of big picture thing that I default to a lot, and that can be handy for a director because your responsibility as a director is the big picture, and then how to shape them in the smaller moments within that big picture. So it just seemed a natural development for me. Yeah.
It's a lot of responsibility. Director.
Yeah, it is.
It's the type of thing that you might wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, wow, am I doing this?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm afraid it is.
Yeah. But there's a great buzz, I can imagine, you know.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite part of directing is being in the rehearsal room with the actors. That's the most rewarding part of it for me. And it is that thing of shaping moments and figuring out just how to make this particular dramatic moment work and make it truthful. For me, that's a really exciting and rewarding thing to do. The second thing then is actually creating the world, which is for me, as a director, I don't consider myself a visionary director, that I have, the visual idea and the sound ideas. So that's about collaboration, where you're bringing in people who do have those ideas and who have expertise in that. And you're saying, okay, this is my feeling of what this world should be or what it feels like. How do we translate that into the things that are going to be in the space, and the things we're going to hear, and the colors and all of that, and the costumes. So that's then a kind of collaborative process about creating the world, which is also exciting, but I consider myself like that's me kind of facilitating something. As a director, you have the final say. If there's going to be a debate as to is it going to go that way or that way, you're the one who has to make the call. But you listen to people who are experts in these things and kind of go, okay, that sounds right to me, based on what I see in this world.
You have a particular interest in theatre in a historical context.
I was afraid you're going to ask that. I kind of. I have directed plays which draw on historical context. Let's put it that way.
And is it the material that you like, or is it the period of history, or what is it that you enjoy?
It's more the distance, I think. I like sort of taking something from a cultural distance or a historical distance and kind of trying to figure out how we can draw on it to create something for now. And I suppose that's what I should preface this with, is that for me, theatre is always about right now. We're creating an experience, an event for an audience to come and engage with, and it has to be significant for them. So I wouldn't be one who would kind of, how do I say, be sort of doctrinaire about getting all of those kind of historical details right. For me, you do the research. You do the research to find out what is essential in that world. But then you've got to then bring that to an audience. I'll give you an example maybe of something that kind of encapsulates how I approach directing when it comes to history and collaboration and all of that kind of thing. And it's not Canterbury Tales, which is the one I know you wanted me to talk about. But I directed The Threepenny Opera by Brecht and Weil. Now, there's an interesting kind of mixture of different kinds of historical influences. It's being written in the 1920s, during the Weimar Republic, and all of the struggles that were happening between communism and fascism that eventually led to the 1930s. So Brecht and Weil were trying to make this kind of social comment on Berlin and Germany at that time. But they drew on this old play, which was from the 18th century, but then they decided to set it in Victorian London. Now, it's very clear from the play that while the play is set in Victorian London, it is an imagined Victorian London. They were using that for, again, the kind of distancing effect that can have. So we can kind of say, okay, they were talking about 1920s Berlin, but they're using, an idea of Victorian London in order to do that. So the version that I directed, which was here, we were using that very, very playfully. So it was Victorian dress, and we chose to do it in Smock Alley Boys' School, which is like this 3-story kind of small space, but narrow, but very, very tall. And it has this gigantically tall red brick wall, which was great for the Victorian atmosphere because it was kind of dark and brooding, and this was set in a sort of London underground world. So it was about creating the atmosphere of that. Brecht and Weil are very clear that the songs are they just kind of happen outside of the story a little bit and comment on the world. They're not necessarily sung in character, even though their characters are assigned to an individual song. So they're very much into we just step out of this world now. So in our version, we had microphone stands. So every time a song came up, the singer went to the microphone stand and sang the song. Now, of course, they don't have microphones in Victorian London. But, you ask the audience to comply with all of the kind of the eclecticism of that, because we were being playful about it. So it just kind of, audiences just took that for granted. It's like, oh yeah, of course they're singing into a microphone. So that's the kind of thing where, we wanted to get to the essence of what Brecht and Weil were doing, and the message that they were trying to convey, And you're sort of drawing on, we did our research around Victorian London and the costuming and exactly what the Queen's position was at that particular moment, because the Queen features in the play. So we were doing all that research, but we weren't saying to the audience that this is a recreation of Victorian London. We were saying this is a kind of imagined recreation to get at the social points that they're trying to make. I should also say that the red brick wall, there's a moment at the end of that play where the Queen's messenger is supposed to arrive on horseback to save the villain Macheath from hanging. How do you do that? We can't have a horse. So I discovered that one of the cast wasn't a qualified abseiler, and we had this 3 to 4 story high red brick wall. So we worked with Abseil Ireland, or whatever the name of the organization was, to get all of those things in place, and the safety in place, and the qualifications in place, and the insurance and all of that. And the messenger abseiled down that giant wall to save Macheath from hanging. So there's another example. I mean, again, another thing that you do as a director is you take what's in front of you and say, okay, what have we got, and how can we make it work in the best possible way? So there was an example of just kind of like, okay, here's a few things coming together to make this moment work.
And you did the Canterbury Tales also in Smock Alley,
Correct.
But upstairs.
Yeah.
So how much will a space influence your vision of the director?
Hugely.
Ah, okay.
Hugely.
Yeah.
I mean, neither of those spaces are theatre spaces originally. And I kind of find that interesting. It can be difficult because they don't necessarily have all of the resources in the right kind of way. But Canterbury Tales, because it's set in this pilgrimage to Canterbury, and all of the pilgrims arrive in a tavern before they launch on this pilgrimage. So and a pilgrimage in medieval times, and we did all the research around that, is very much a holiday. Like all of that high pressure, kind of very rigidly hierarchical society. Sort of those hierarchies are just released for this moment in time. So it's very much a sense of conviviality, and some of those the kind of class distinctions kind of breaking down a little bit for those. So we wanted something that kind of reflected that was convivial, that was where people gathered and drank. We ended up going further than that again, in a collaborative way. We discussed it we got the School of Culinary Arts on board. So we thought, okay, we're going to create an event where not only will the audience watch the play, but they will sit at banquet tables in Smock Alley Banquet Hall and have a meal served to them at the interval. And that was very much like, okay, let's kind of bring some of the talents that we have in the different disciplines here in the college together, so we can create something really, really special. So that space was just ideal for it because it was open, it was big, it had a kitchen attached. That was like a crucial thing. It's like, okay, good idea, but how are you going to make it work? And it had a kitchen right beside it that was a fully functioning professional kitchen. So the School of Culinary Arts were like, okay, this is possible now.
What on earth are you going to do in the new campus in Grange Gorman with all these spaces at your disposal?
Yeah, well, as much as we can. Yeah. I mean, it will be great to have that level of facilities, because we've been without that kind of level for a while. So yeah, I mean, and they will be more traditional spaces. There's a black box, and then there's the concert hall. And the black box just gives you loads of flexibility. You can kind of create the world. That's why it's called a black box. It's just this neutral black, and then you kind of create what you need to with it. And it's very, very adaptable. You can have different kinds of audience configurations. You have different levels. So all of those things were discussed in the planning, and that gives you great scope for kind of different ways of having a stage-audience relationship, which is really, really useful. Because there's the traditional tiered seating front on, but then there's like, okay, what if we put the audience higher? What if we bring them closer? What if we put them on stage? Again, it's like, what is the project? The project has to necessitate that. You don't just do it for the sake of it. But yeah.
And for our current students and for any prospective students, I mean, we're going to be on a campus with so many other disciplines as well. So you've already done a project with the culinary people, so I can only imagine what kind of ideas you're going to come up with when you've got, the art and media and all the different disciplines there.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that's really important to recognize is that those levels of collaboration take a lot of planning. They can't just happen. So Canterbury Tales was 1.5 years in the making. And, you have to make sure that each discipline is getting what they need from a project. So it was really important, for example, that culinary arts, they were not catering our event. They were engaging their students in a really interesting historical project around that historical period in relation to food and again, conviviality. So they were working with that, and that was serving them. So you have to make sure that everyone's getting what they need from it, and that's a tricky balance to strike. But yeah, there are lots of opportunities, absolutely. So we're looking forward to them.
My last question for you: if you had to go off onto some desert island for a month by yourself, and you could only take the collected works of one writer, who would you take?
Oh, no, I can't choose one. I'll tell you who my favourite writers are in relation to dramatic writers: Samuel Beckett, Tennessee Williams, William Shakespeare. So can I have 3?
Oh, of course. Yeah. No problem. Get a bigger suitcase.
Yeah, exactly.